Welcome, ladies and gents, to Schisms. All right, so if you are planning on only listening to the first ism after this, then you might be wondering, in manje is schism? Well, my dear children, when isms met skit, it was a steamy and memorable night that resulted in the birth of a child who they named, that's right, they named her Schisms. Ngamanye amazwi, a schism is a skit that shares brief information to shed more light on a topic related to an ism, which is what we call a complete episode of the ISMS podcast. The European conquest is one of the most decisive occurrences in human history. From 1492 to 1914, Europe managed to conquer 84% of the world. But despite this importance, the European conquest of the world is still severely misunderstood because it's often easy to assume that conquest was just a series of coup d'etat to unexpected and often primitive human populations. However, as with everything, the truth is not that simple. You see, there are several other decisive factors apart from the battlefield that, if spoken of more often, I believe would probably change your perspective on the course that was taken by history to get us to the present. It might even change your perspective on your own and other races. Diseases such as smallpox also had quite a profound impact on the fate of human societies, even more than war in some cases. Ranked by the World Health Organization as one of the deadliest diseases in human history, smallpox was caused by the variola virus of the genus orthopox virus, which includes viruses such as those responsible for monkeypox and cowpox. The smallpox virus had two principal varieties, namely variola minor, which had an average fatality rate of 1 to 2%, and variola major, with a devastating fatality rate of 20 to 40%. Variola minor caused a mild rash that would usually disappear within a few months after infection. On the other hand, the rash that was caused by variola major was a lot worse, and it would usually leave marks that persisted years after the victim's recovery. And as if that wasn't bad enough, variola major was also known to cause blindness and paralysis. Victims of smallpox, particularly variola major, would begin to experience fever and malaise just 12 to 14 days after infection, and then 2 to 4 days after the onset of fever, the characteristic rash would begin to appear, along with ulcerated lesions on the pharynx, the buccal mucous membranes, and the tongue. The ulceration of these lesions is what caused the virus to be excreted into the saliva and mucus, and direct contact with these fluids was the main point of transmission. Victims would usually die 10 to 16 days after the occurrence of fever, and those who were fortunate to recover would become permanently immune to the illness and cease transmitting it to others. Smallpox's early arrival in Europe became a great advantage for conquest because European voyagers would carry their diseases along with them to foreign lands, where they would then transfer them to populations who had never been previously exposed to them and thus had never developed immunity towards them. Smallpox was a crowd disease, as it could only be maintained in a population of at least 200,000 people. Now, it's uncertain as to what species humans got smallpox from, because there are reasons to believe that it could have mutated from an orthopox virus that was found in early humans, or from the culprit behind monkeypox or cowpox, or possibly even from a rodent virus, quite possibly from a rodent virus. However, although the natural reservoir species of the precursor of smallpox is uncertain, two things that are more certain is that smallpox is originally from North Africa, and it could only be established in our species after the establishment of food production, as a hunter-gatherer lifestyle could just not even begin to supply enough food to sustain populations of such magnitude. The second schism, which I titled The Coevolution of the Pathogen and the Host, I explain how a disease like smallpox becomes specific to humans even though transferred from another host. I also explain how both the pathogen and the host grow stronger over time. Be sure to check it out on the ISMS podcast YouTube channel and other platforms, including social media, of course. The earliest historical evidence of what is likely to be smallpox are what appeared to be pockmarks on an Egyptian mummy from around 1500 BC. The early trade route that connected Eurasia to Africa must have been how the disease made its way to Eurasia. Smallpox was endemic in the most populous regions of Eurasia from Spain to Japan by 500 AD, and it was introduced to the East and West Africa by Islamic merchants or travelers that were merchandising or traveling there. In the Americas, smallpox was introduced in 1520 by a slave from Spanish Cuba, and Europeans are said to have practiced a naughty habit of gifting Native Americans with blankets that had been used by smallpox victims. Although there are no stats to confirm just how much of an effect each of these introductions had, 95% of the pre-Columbian Native American population was destroyed by the late 1600s, taking the native population from 20 million to just over a million by the time European settlement began in the region. Smallpox had managed to spread ahead of the Europeans to the most populous regions of America, including the fertile Mississippi valleys, where the many towns that had once flourished with Native American beauty and diversity were already virtually empty by the time the first Frenchmen settled around the area in 1608. In modern-day Cape Town, South Africa, smallpox arrived in February 1713, ironically also in a fabric previously used by a victim of the disease, but this time it was a Dutchman who was on a ship that was passing from India back to Europe. It ravaged a quarter of the slave and white populations, but it proved far more fatal to the native Khoisan who had never been previously exposed to the disease. Exact stats are unavailable. However, reports given to the governor by the few remaining Khoisan in the February of the following year were that the epidemic killed more than 90% of the people in the affected populations, and in some cases, whole clans were wiped out completely. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there were two more smallpox waves that hit the region in 1755 and then again in 1767, and the Khoisan populations were reduced to near extinction amidst a furiously expanding European colony. And they never recovered from those blows up until today. In 1853, smallpox also wreaked havoc in Hawaii, where populations had already suffered severe reductions from other crowd diseases that were introduced to the Pacific Islands by Captain Cook in 1779. No cure was ever discovered for smallpox. However, immunization attempts date back as far as the 15th century, and India and China were the first to independently develop the variolation method, which involved inoculating with pus from the smallpox pustules. The drawbacks of the method were that it would cause severe lesions around the inoculation region, and it had a fatality rate of 1 to 2%. Variolation then spread to the Ottoman Empire and was introduced to Bohemia and England in the early 18th century. The second method of immunization was the vaccination method, which later led to the eradication of the virus. It was first developed by an English physician who went by the name of Edward Jenner in the 1790s, when he observed that milkmaids did not get smallpox if they had previously acquired cowpox from cows. Vaccination produced much less severe lesions and virtually no deaths. Smallpox claimed her last victim, who went by the name of Jeanette Parker, in 1978. She was an English medical photographer who died about a month after being infected. To the world's joy, smallpox was declared as eradicated by the World Health Organization just 2 years after she claimed the last victim, and the pathogen now only remains as a potential biological weapon at the hands of the nations who still have the virus stored in their laboratories. Smallpox is a good example of just how much indirect variables like diseases also had quite a decisive but rarely mentioned contribution to the world losing all the human diversity Chris Columbus and Jan van Riebeeck were blessed to witness when they first stepped foot in their respective to-be colonies that have become the Eurocentric world that we live in today. Till next time, stay loving, always have faith, and don't stop asking questions.